Welcome back to another episode of Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the past in the most wonderfully mundane way possible. Tonight, we're traveling back to medieval times to examine some of the most peculiar torture methods ever devised by human imagination. Don't worry, we'll discuss these historical curiosities in the driest, academic manner possible, perfect for helping your mind drift off to sleep. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's begin our journey into the strange world of medieval punishment. Before we begin, you may wonder why medieval people devised such bizarre methods of punishment. The answer is surprisingly simple and rather boring. Medieval societies operated under completely different legal systems than we do today. Most of these methods were designed not necessarily to cause harm, but to publicly humiliate or extract confessions. Many of these so-called torture devices were actually quite rare, used more as psychological deterrents than actual instruments of pain. The medieval mind had a peculiar relationship with justice, one that often involved elaborate theatrical displays rather than efficient punishment. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the steady rhythm of ancient knowledge guide you into peaceful rest. Let's begin with perhaps the most common and mundane of medieval punishments, the stocks and pillows. These wooden restraining devices, widespread throughout the medieval towns of Europe, were tools of both physical restraint and public humiliation. Found in nearly every town square, they were as much about enforcing social norms through public shaming as they were about punishing the individual. The very sight of the stocks and pillory became synonymous with wrongdoing, and the people subjected to these punishments would forever be associated with their crime, whether minor or major. These devices were often set up in the central public spaces of towns, places where markets were held, religious ceremonies took place, and people gathered for gossip and news. Punishments in this case were not only about correction, but about social control, reinforcing the power structures of medieval society. The stocks were in their simplest form, large wooden boards with strategically placed holes that would trap the offender's feet and sometimes hands in place, often for hours if not longer. In many towns they were used for minor offences, like being drunk in public, gossiping, selling stale bread, or even making false accusations. The stocks were considered a relatively light punishment, but they still carried significant social consequence. The offender would be publicly restrained in an uncomfortable position, often with their limbs immobilized, as a clear signal to the community that they had violated the established norms of social conduct. While the stocks were primarily a tool for restraining the feet, they were sometimes more elaborately constructed, with additional holes designed to secure the hands or even the neck. The idea behind this was that certain crimes required greater humiliation or longer durations of exposure. When someone was caught committing a particularly grievous minor offense, they could be forced to stand for hours or days in the stocks, immobilized for the entire public to see. The psychological effects of being publicly exposed in this way were not limited to the physical discomfort, embarrassment, shame, and humiliation, were considered just as important in the medieval punishment system. What made the stocks particularly effective as a tool of punishment was their capacity to instill fear and shame within the local population. Medieval society was deeply concerned with maintaining moral order, and public punishment was used as a visible reminder of the consequences of deviating from societal expectations. The stocks, placed prominently in town squares, became symbols of justice and order. They were meant to show the community that the authorities had control over the people's behavior, and they used public humiliation as an important tool for reinforcing that control. For the person sentenced to the stocks, the punishment was not just about standing still for an extended period of time. It was about being subjected to public scorn. Townspeople could walk by, stare at the offender, point, mock, or even jeer at. Occasionally, they would engage in more physical acts of humiliation, like throwing rotten fruit, eggs, or stones. These actions not only contributed to the offender's physical discomfort, but also reinforced the social stigmas associated with their crime. The humiliating nature of the punishment was seen as a powerful tool for socializing individuals back into the moral framework of the community. Interestingly, some medieval towns had formal regulations about what could be thrown at offenders in the stock. While stones were typically forbidden due to the risk of serious injury, towns often allowed softer projectiles, such as overripe fruits, vegetables, and eggs, to be thrown at the accused. Sometimes the projectiles were even meant to be part of the process, intended to reflect the act of social punishment in a more symbolic way, rather than causing actual harm. The throwing of produce was seen as a form of acceptable public interaction, a method for the townsfolk to vent their frustration or indignation at the crime. In fact, many towns employed children to act as designated stock throwers. These children would be given a few coins in exchange for their work, which often involved picking up the discarded fruits and throwing them at the unfortunate individuals in the stock. These stock throwers provided a means of maintaining a steady, gentle barrage of produce, ensuring that the social consequences of the punishment were meted out appropriately. The children's role also provided a social dynamic where the punishment could be seen as part of the community's interaction with the offender, reinforcing the collective nature of justice. The pillory was a device similar to the stocks, but it focused more on the head and hands rather than just the feet. The pillory was typically used for crimes considered to be slightly more severe than those punished by the stocks, but still not serious enough to warrant corporal punishment or death. While the stocks immobilized the offender's feet, the pillory restrained the person's head and hands, making the experience of being trapped even more uncomfortable. The individual's head would be placed in a wooden frame with holes, and their hands were usually bound in the holes, forcing them to stand in a rigid position for extended periods of time. What set the pillory apart from the stocks was the level of physical exposure it provided. The pillory allowed for greater interaction between the offender and the public. The person in the pillory was far more vulnerable, as they could not escape verbal abuse, insults, or even physical projectiles thrown by onlookers. As with the stocks, the pillory was often used for minor offences, such as cheating, slander, or being publicly intoxicated. However, it was considered a slightly harsher punishment than the stocks, because it often involved prolonged exposure to the public's gaze and ridicule. In some cases, the punishment could last for hours or even days, depending on the severity of the crime. The pillory also had an additional social function. It acted as a more active punishment compared to the stock. In the stocks, the offender was often left to simply stand in one place, while in the pillory, the person was more susceptible to being humiliated by the crowd. The social dynamic of the pillory was far more interactive, and the punishment itself could be seen as a form of communal entertainment, where townsfolk would take pleasure in the offender's public disgrace. While this form of punishment was designed to deter further misbehavior, it also allowed the community to engage in a form of public justice, where they had a direct hand in maintaining the moral code of the town. Despite the seeming severity of being trapped in the stocks or pillory, the punishment's real effect was often the boredom and mind-numbing repetition associated with it. Many offenders would find themselves in the stocks or pillory multiple times throughout their lives for minor offences. For the townspeople, these events became mundane and routine, like watching the same performance play out time and time again. The same drunk miller might find himself in the stocks every few weeks, the same gossiping housewife being paraded through town for spreading rumors, all of which became predictable and dull for the community. It wasn't necessarily the physical discomfort that made these punishments effective. It was the social isolation and tedium of the experience. Medieval records show that many of those who were punished by being put in the stocks or pillory did little more than stand there, occasionally being pelted with food or subjected to harsh moral lectures from passing clergy or other moral authority. In fact, the punishment was less about physical discomfort and more about the crushing psychological burden of public exposure. The humiliation was amplified by the sense of being trapped in one position, unable to move, escape, or interact with others in any meaningful way. One of the most boring aspects of stocks and pillories was the constant need for maintenance. These wooden devices, exposed to the elements and subjected to repeated use, required regular attention. Town carpenters were responsible for ensuring that the stocks and pillories were in good working order, which meant repairing rotting wood, replacing broken boards, and ensuring that the mechanisms used to lock the offender in place were functioning properly. In many towns, the local carpenters' records were filled with the repetitive, dull task of maintaining these devices. Carpenters would spend long hours repairing and refurbishing the stocks, oiling hinges to prevent them from creaking, replacing wood that had worn out, and ensuring that the holes were properly aligned to fit the offender. This constant upkeep was essential for maintaining the functional efficiency of these devices, as any failure could mean the device could not be used for its intended purpose of enforcing public justice. Interestingly, town records about stock repairs often make for some of the most tedious and mundane reading in medieval administrative texts. They are full of dry, straightforward entries about which part of the stocks needed to be replaced and when the repairs took place. For anyone looking to understand the sheer monotony of maintaining medieval punishment devices, these records serve as a perfect example of how the justice system, despite its dramatic public spectacle, was often a boring and repetitive affair for those involved in its administration. Moving on from the ubiquitous stocks and pillory, we arrive at a slightly more unusual and perhaps absurd form of punishment: the ducking stool. The ducking stool was primarily used to punish women, particularly those who were accused of being scolds, gossips, or shrews, terms that were applied to women who were considered excessively vocal, disruptive, or generally out of line with the expected social behavior of the time. The device itself was relatively simple in design, but it involved a form of public spectacle that had both ritualistic and punitive elements, reflecting the deep social anxieties surrounding women's voices and their place in medieval society. The ducking stool was essentially a chair, often mounted on a wooden beam or arm, which was positioned above a body of water, typically a pond or river. The accused would be tied to the chair, and then at the whim of the town officials or sometimes a crowd, the stool would be hoisted over the water and repeatedly dunked, submerging the person in the cold, often murky waters below. The purpose of this act was to purge the woman of her verbal sins by forcing her into the water, ostensibly to cool her temper and silence her. In a society that often viewed women's speech and behavior as problematic if it was not confined to the domestic space, the ducking stool was a way to physically silence women and punish them for their perceived transgression. The ducking stool's most striking feature was its clear gendered nature. It was overwhelmingly used to punish women, reflecting the broader societal norms and gender roles of medieval Europe. Women who were deemed too outspoken, too contentious, or who broke the bounds of social propriety by speaking out of turn, were often accused of being scolds. The scold's punishment was rooted in the idea that women who spoke too much were somehow a threat to social order, and were by extension a threat to male authority. Medieval society placed a premium on silence, particularly for women in the public sphere. The role of women was largely confined to the home, where their voices could be heard within the family, but were not supposed to be expressed outside of that domestic realm. To speak in public, to voice one's opinion, or to engage in social discourse beyond prescribed roles, was viewed as dangerous, unruly, and potentially disruptive. The ducking stool, in its essence, was a tool to reinforce these boundaries. It sought to silence the women who threatened the status quo, making them publicly vulnerable and submissive, and reinforcing their silence as a virtue. Interestingly, women were not the only targets of the ducking stool. Although the device was mostly reserved for punishing women for their disruptive behaviors, it could also be used against men who were considered to be overly boisterous or unruly in the public sphere. However, such cases were rare, and the device's association with women's silence and obedience remained its defining feature. The ducking stool was ultimately a reflection of medieval society's anxiety about women asserting their voices in public, and its desire to regulate women's public personas by using both shame. What made the ducking stool particularly absurd was not just the ritual of dunking, but the elaborate social spectacle that often surrounded it. The ducking, much like the use of the stocks and pillory, was a public event, and one that was often turned into a social gathering. Town criers or local officials would announce the event to ensure that as many people as possible would come to witness the spectacle. The event would often be marked by lengthy speeches or sermons delivered by local authorities, including the clergy or civic leaders, extolling the importance of moral conduct, proper behavior, and the dangers of public misbehavior. In some places, the townspeople would even participate in the event, sometimes vocally supporting the punishment. The idea was that the offender's misdeeds were not just an individual's failing, but a social failure, one that required communal attention, and, in some cases, collective intervention. Women who were accused of being scolds or gossips were effectively made an example of, with the larger public watching, participating, and even engaging in the punishment process. The townspeople were expected to pass judgment on the offender by voicing their disapproval and ensuring that the public punishment meted out served as a clear signal to others that such behavior would not be tolerated. The ducking stool was both a form of punitive justice and a performance that allowed the community to reaffirm its moral boundaries. The spectacle was often attended with much fanfare, sometimes even mocked or cheered by onlookers. In this sense, the punishment was not just about disciplining the individual, but also about reinforcing social cohesion through public shaming. The offender's humiliation was a way for the community to demonstrate its collective commitment to maintaining order and adhering to the moral codes that defined the medieval world. In many places, there were strict guidelines about how the punishment was to be carried out. These regulations were put in place to ensure that the punishment was deemed appropriate and not excessive, although the very nature of the punishments, submerging someone in water, was inherently unpleasant and could be seen as dangerous or cruel. First, the town officials or other appointed authorities often had specific rules for how many times the accused was to be dunked into the water. The length of each dunk, how many dunks were appropriate, and how long the entire process could last, were often clearly delineated. The local authorities were expected to follow these rules carefully to avoid accusations of excessive punishment or cruelty. Some towns went as far as to regulate the temperature of the water to ensure it was neither too cold nor too warm. Too cold, and the punishment might be deemed too harsh; too warm, and it could be seen as ineffective. These measures, though seemingly trivial, show the importance of ritual and regulation in the administration of punishment, even when the punishment itself was designed to humiliate and inflict discomfort. The preparation for a ducking was also surprisingly elaborate. The stool had to be inspected for safety and durability, as there were concerns that the person being punished could be injured in the process. The water depth had to be carefully measured to ensure that it was deep enough for the dunking, but not so deep that it would cause harm to the individual. In some cases, the water needed to be tested for cleanliness, as towns wanted to avoid any health risks associated with dunking someone into contaminated water. These regulations, as bureaucratic as they seem, demonstrate the degree to which medieval communities felt the need to standardize punishment to ensure that it was carried out properly. In the winter months, when the rivers or ponds froze over, the ducking stool became largely unusable. This led to lengthy and often quite boring debates in town councils about what alternative punishments should be used during the cold months. These discussions, preserved in town records, are full of minute details about how the community could maintain order and control when the ducking stool was not an option. The alternatives, however, were often less dramatic, such as public shaming through forced wearing of a sign or other forms of ritual humiliation. The stool itself required regular maintenance to ensure that it was in working condition. The wooden chair needed to be treated to prevent rot, and the mechanism that allowed the stool to be dunked into the water had to be checked frequently. Like the stocks and pillory, the ducking stool was a piece of equipment that required the town to allocate resources to its upkeep. In some cases, towns even employed ducking stool keepers, officials responsible for the maintenance and operation of the device. These keepers likely had one of the most monotonous and repetitive jobs in medieval society. Their responsibilities included ensuring that the stool was always ready for use, and that the process of dunking was carried out according to the established regulation. For these keepers, the job was not only a form of social control, but also an enduring source of boredom, with little in the way of excitement or variety in their daily tasks. By the 18th century, the use of the ducking stool had largely fallen out of favour, though it lingered in some places longer than others. The practice became increasingly viewed as cruel and excessive, and with the rise of more rational approaches to punishment during the Enlightenment, devices like the ducking stool were increasingly seen as inhumane and barbaric. However, its legacy lived on in the form of cultural and historical awareness of the power of public humiliation as a tool of social control. Despite its eventual decline, the ducking stool remains a fascinating reflection of medieval society's views on women's voices and behavior, and the lengths to which authorities would go to maintain social norms and public order. The spectacle of the ducking stool, like many medieval punishments, was designed not only to punish the individual, but to reaffirm the community's moral and social boundaries. The process was more than just about the person being punished. It was about everyone who witnessed the event, reinforcing the idea that moral behavior was something to be publicly displayed and collectively maintained. Perhaps one of the most peculiar and deeply gendered medieval punishment devices was the branks, also known as the scold's bridle. This was an iron contraption designed to fit over a person's head, with a metal plate or spike inserted into the mouth to press down on the tongue, making it physically difficult or in some cases impossible for the wearer to speak. The branks was a device used to punish women, primarily those who were accused of being scolds, a term used for women who were perceived to be overly talkative, argumentative or rebellious in their speech, particularly towards men or the social norms of the time. It's a punishment that specifically highlights the medieval view of women's roles in society, focusing on their voices as a form of social and moral regulation. The scold's bridle was part of a broader medieval and early modern concern about controlling women's speech. This device was designed to physically silence a woman who was seen as disrupting the social order with her words, particularly if she was vocal in ways that were considered inappropriate for women. In essence, it was a method of public humiliation and physical restraint, meant to both punish and control the individual while also sending a message to the wider community about the power of male authority and social norms. The branks itself was a simple but effective design, often made of iron. It was a cage-like contraption that fit over the person's head, and its most distinctive feature was the metal plate or spike that would press down on the tongue. This was not a device designed for severe physical pain, but it was certainly uncomfortable and humiliating. The tongue was forced down or restrained, preventing the individual from speaking, and in some cases making it difficult for them to breathe or swallow properly. There were variations in the construction of the branks, but the essential features remained consistent. The metal device would fit tightly over the head, and the tongue would either be forced down by a flat plate or pinched by a sharp spike. The device was designed to be locked in place, preventing the woman from removing it without assistance, often forcing her into an uncomfortable or painful state for the duration of the punishment. The device would be worn for hours, sometimes during public events, in order to humiliate the woman and deter her from repeating her offense. While the branks was often viewed as a public punishment, the designs varied, with some featuring more decorative elements. Some were adorned with engravings, symbols, or even bells that would ring as the wearer moved their head. The bells added an extra layer of public exposure, creating an audible sound that would announce the presence of the offender to anyone near. These bells might also serve to make the punishment more theatrical, amplifying the sense of embarrassment. On the other hand, simpler versions of the branks were purely functional, lacking any decorative features, and emphasizing the discomfort and silencing of the woman. The use of the branks was intrinsically gendered. It was a punishment almost exclusively meted out to women, underscoring the medieval concern with controlling women's behavior, specifically their voices. In a society where women were expected to be silent, subservient, and obedient, the act of speaking out, being too loud or challenging the authority of men, was seen as a violation of the natural order. The branks symbolized the suppression of female autonomy, particularly the autonomy of speech. which was considered a direct challenge to male authority. Women who were labelled as scolds were often those who expressed their opinions too freely, argued with their husbands, or spoke negatively about others in public spaces. The branks then was not just a punishment for the specific crime of verbal dispute. It was part of a wider system of controlling women's behaviour, especially their public and private speech. This punishment was a direct response to the idea that a woman's voice could, in some sense, upset the moral and social order of the time. Medieval society held rigid notions about the appropriate roles of women, and these roles were often defined by silence, passivity, and obedience. Women were expected to manage the household and raise children, but their voices in public discourse were unwelcome. Women who stepped out of these prescribed roles by engaging in arguments, public complaints, or excessive talking were often viewed as threatening the social order. Punishing these women with the branks reinforced the gendered expectations of silence and obedience that were deeply entrenched in medieval and early modern societies. The punishment of the branks was typically used for relatively minor offences, often relating to a woman's supposed failure to maintain appropriate decorum or manners. A woman might be sentenced to wear the branks for complaining about the quality of bread at the market, or for engaging in a public quarrel with a neighbour over property boundary. In these instances, the punishment didn't fit the severity of the crime, but was instead intended to correct the behaviour of the woman and silence her in a very literal and painful way. When women were sentenced to wear the branks, they were often paraded through the streets or publicly displayed. This public humiliation was an integral part of the punishment. It wasn't enough simply to silence the woman. The point was to make her a spectacle for the entire community. The branks, by physically constraining her mouth and preventing her from speaking, also served to reinforce the idea that her behavior was inappropriate and deserving of ridicule. Her silence, enforced by the device, became a symbol of her moral failure, and the punishment was meant to strip her of her agency, making her unable to speak, defend herself, or even protest the punishment. The public nature of this punishment was designed to shame the individual, but also to shame anyone who might consider behaving similarly. The branks was a form of social correction, not just for the woman wearing it, but for the wider community as well. By publicly humiliating the woman, the authorities reinforced the social norms of the time, showing that those who spoke too much or acted out of turn could expect severe consequences. As with the stocks, pillories, and ducking stools, the branks was not only a form of punishment, but a public spectacle. The more eyes that saw the punishment, the more effectively it could reinforce the social norms it was designed to uphold. In some towns, people would gather in the town square or market to witness the spectacle of the woman in the branks. The sight of a woman wearing the branks and being humiliated in public would serve as a warning to others about the consequences of transgressing social boundaries. Public humiliation was considered an essential part of the branks punishment, because it was a form of social enforcement. The act of watching someone being punished, of participating in the ridicule, was seen as a way for the community to collectively assert its control over individuals who might threaten its cohesion. The public could see the direct result of moral disobedience, reinforcing the idea that silence and obedience were virtues, particularly for women. The branks not only punished the individual but reinforced the collective power of the community, particularly in enforcing gender norms. In towns where this device was used, the branks became a visible symbol of authority and the social order. The community was expected to endorse these actions by either participating in the punishment or by tacitly supporting the structures of control. For many medieval communities, the act of watching a woman be silenced was a reaffirmation of their own place within a rigidly structured society. By the 18th century, the branks fell out of favour, along with many other forms of corporal and public punishment. This decline was part of a broader shift in attitudes toward criminal justice, as Enlightenment thinkers began to advocate for more humane forms of punishment and the recognition of individual rights. The concept of rehabilitation over humiliation began to gain traction, and practices like the branks were increasingly viewed as archaic and cruel. Nonetheless, the legacy of the branks and the social control it represented lived on in later forms of gendered oppression. The idea of controlling women's speech and behavior persisted for centuries, and the branks served as a harsh reminder of the lengths to which medieval society was willing to go to enforce silence and conformity. The branks, while no longer in use, remains a powerful symbol of how medieval punishment systems were specifically designed to regulate the lives and voices of women, often punishing them for speaking out or challenging their assigned roles. The scold's bridle, more than just a medieval tool of punishment, was a tool of social and gender control, one that silenced women, both physically and symbolically. Date of tool. One of the more unusual medieval punishments was the drunkard's cloak, a large barrel with holes cut for the head and arms. The accused would be forced to wear this barrel while walking through town, advertising their offense to everyone they met. The drunkard's cloak was used primarily for public intoxication, though it was also sometimes employed for other moral offenses like adultery or theft. What made this punishment particularly tedious was how long it took to prepare. The barrel had to be properly sized, the holes had to be cut to the right dimensions, and the entire contraption had to be sturdy enough to withstand hours of wear. Medieval towns kept detailed records of drunkards' cloak usage, including measurements, duration of punishment, and even weather conditions during the sentence. These records reveal a surprising level of bureaucratic attention to what was essentially a very simple punishment. The logistics of the drunkard's cloak were surprisingly complex. The barrel had to be light enough for the person to carry, but heavy enough to be genuinely burdensome. Too light, and the punishment was ineffective. Too heavy, and it became dangerous. Medieval craftsmen developed specific techniques for creating the perfect balance. One of the most boring aspects of the drunkard's cloak was the maintenance required. Barrels would crack, develop splinters, or become infested with insects. Towns employed coopers specifically to maintain punishment barrels, leading to what might be the most monotonous job in medieval history. The social dynamics of the drunkard's cloak were also remarkably predictable. The same individuals would repeatedly find themselves sentenced to wear the barrel, creating a tedious cycle of offense and punishment. Medieval court records show that some people were sentenced to the drunkard's cloak dozens of times throughout their lives. Despite its dramatic name, the Wheel of Fortune was actually one of the more boring medieval punishments. This large wooden wheel was used to display criminals who had been sentenced to death, but the actual process was remarkably mundane. The condemned person would be tied to the wheel and left there for hours or days, depending on the severity of their crime. What made this punishment particularly tedious was the elaborate protocol surrounding it. The wheel had to be positioned at the correct angle, the ropes had to be tied in specific patterns, and the entire process had to be witnessed by the appropriate officials. Medieval records describe the incredibly detailed preparations for wheel punishment. The wheel itself had to be inspected for structural integrity. The height had to be measured to ensure visibility from the required distance, and the weather conditions had to be suitable for the punishment to be effective. The maintenance of punishment wheels was surprisingly complex. The wood had to be treated to withstand weather, the metal fittings had to be kept rust-free, and the entire mechanism had to be regularly tested for safety. Towns employed wheel keepers, whose job was to ensure these devices remained in proper working order. What made the Wheel of Fortune particularly boring was its passive nature. Unlike more active punishments, the wheel simply required the condemned person to remain stationary for extended periods. Medieval accounts described the mind-numbing monotony of wheel punishment, both for the condemned and for the guards required to watch them. The wheel punishment also had seasonal variations that added to its tedium. In winter, condemned individuals might be covered with blankets to prevent death from exposure, defeating much of the punishment's purpose. In summer, they might be given water to prevent dehydration, again reducing the severity of the sentence. One of the most peculiar medieval punishments was the shame flute, a heavy iron flute that was locked around the neck of musicians who played poorly or at inappropriate times. The flute was designed to be uncomfortable and impossible to play, serving as both punishment and public humiliation. The shame flute was used primarily for street musicians, minstrels and other performers who violated local noise ordinances, or performed without proper permits. What made this punishment particularly absurd was the elaborate process of determining musical quality. Medieval towns often employed official music critics whose job was to evaluate performances and recommend punishments. The construction of shame flutes was surprisingly varied. Some were simple iron tubes, others were elaborate contraptions with multiple chambers, false keys, and decorative elements designed to make the punishment more humiliating. The most boring shame flutes were completely plain, focusing entirely on discomfort rather than spectacle. Medieval records show that shame flutes were often used for remarkably minor musical offences. A minstrel might be sentenced to wear the shame flute for singing off-key, playing too loudly, or performing songs with inappropriate lyrics. The punishment typically lasted several days, during which the musician would be unable to perform, and would serve as a warning to others. The process of fitting a shame flute was incredibly methodical. The device had to be properly sized to the individual's neck, adjusted for the correct level of discomfort, and secured with multiple locks. Town officials would often spend considerable time ensuring the flute was applied correctly, making the entire process tediously bureaucratic. What made shame flutes particularly boring was their effectiveness in completely silencing musical performance. Unlike other punishments that allowed some form of activity, the shame flute made any musical expression impossible, creating a silent, tedious punishment that affected the entire community's entertainment. Similar to the Branks or Scold's bridle, the Gossip's bridle was another unique punishment designed to physically silence women deemed guilty of excessive talking, spreading rumors, or generally engaging in verbal misdeeds. This form of public punishment, while rooted in the same social pressures and gendered expectations as the Branks, was often more elaborate, serving not only as a means to restrain speech, but also as a tool for public humiliation and social control. It reflects the medieval obsession with regulating women's voices, particularly those deemed to be disruptive, noisy, or disobedient. The Gossip's bridle was constructed from metal, typically iron, and featured a cage-like structure that fit over the person's head. What set this device apart from others like the Branks was its elaborate design. While the Branks was a relatively simple iron cage with a tongue-damming plate, the Gossip's bridle was often adorned with additional decorative elements, bells, chains, and engravings, designed not only to restrain the woman's speech, but to amplify her public humiliation. The bells attached to the bridle made the punishment particularly absurd. As the wearer of the bridle moved her head or attempted to speak, the bells would ring, drawing even more attention to her predicament. These jingling sounds ensured that the woman's punishment was impossible to ignore, making her public shaming even more excruciating. In a way, the bells served as a form of social control, loud, constant reminders of the woman's misdeeds that could not be avoided or escaped by the offender. This added auditory element made it a social spectacle, ensuring that the wearer was constantly reminded of their status as an offender in the eyes of the community. Moreover, the chains attached to the bridle could restrict the wearer's movement, adding to the discomfort. The metal plates or spikes, designed to silence the offender by pressing down on the tongue or jaw, were designed to make speaking difficult, ensuring that the woman could not defend herself or voice any further complaint. The device's main goal was to prevent verbal communication, which was viewed as the source of the offence. The construction of the Gossip's bridle, with its more sophisticated components, represented a distinct emphasis on public spectacle. It was not merely about physically silencing a woman, it was about making her punishment as visible and humiliating as possible. The use of decorative engravings, often featuring religious or moral symbols, further emphasized the idea that this punishment was not just about silencing a woman's voice, but about sending a clear social message about acceptable behavior and the consequences of transgressing societal norms. The Gossip's bridle was explicitly gendered in its application. It was a tool of control specifically for women, reflecting the deeply ingrained patriarchal views of medieval society that placed significant restrictions on women's autonomy, especially their public speech. A woman's voice, particularly when it was used to engage in gossip, was seen as a social threat. Women who spread rumors or talked excessively were perceived as undermining the moral fabric of the community, creating discord and disrupting the natural order. In medieval society, women were expected to conform to very specific social roles. They were seen as responsible for managing the household, raising children, and maintaining the moral integrity of the family unit. Public speech and verbal expression were considered a man's domain, and women were expected to speak only when necessary, adhering to their roles as passive listeners or subordinates. When women stepped outside these boundaries and became vocal, particularly in public or about matters that were considered inappropriate, such as personal matters or the lives of others, they were labeled as scolds or gossip. The punishment of the gossip's bridle, then, was not merely about silencing inappropriate speech. It was about reasserting control over women's voices and ensuring that they remained within their prescribed roles. The punishment reinforced the belief that women should be obedient and restrained, their voices kept in check, and their social interactions regulated. This control over speech was a central mechanism by which medieval society reinforced gender norms, making the gossip's bridle not just a punishment for individuals, but a tool for maintaining the social order. What makes the gossip's bridle particularly fascinating is how seriously medieval society took the issue of speech regulation. Legal frameworks were established around the idea of appropriate speech, with many laws specifically targeting women's voices. It wasn't enough to simply punish actions. Words had consequences, especially if those words were seen as potentially harmful to the moral order of society. Rumor-mongering, spreading lies, and talking excessively were viewed as dangerous behaviors that could disrupt the social fabric. In some cases, entire legal codes were created that defined scolding or gossiping as offenses that warranted punishment. These offenses often fell into the category of moral transgressions, where the act of spreading false rumors or speaking too freely was seen as a violation of communal harmony. This was especially true for women, whose voices were considered powerful and potentially destabilizing if not carefully controlled. The gossip's bridle, therefore, was not just a punishment. It was part of a broader social and legal effort to curb the influence of women's speech in the public domain. The specific offenses that could lead to a woman being sentenced to wear the gossip's bridle were surprisingly particular and detailed. A woman might find herself subjected to this punishment for actions as minor as repeating a rumor about a neighbor's financial difficulties, or discussing the personal life of a local merchant. These kinds of seemingly trivial offenses were seen as disruptive to the social fabric, particularly if they involved reputations, financial stability, or private matters. For medieval communities, maintaining good name and honor was of paramount importance, and any form of gossip that threatened an individual's reputation could lead to serious consequences. Gossip was often viewed as a form of social aggression, where the power of words was used to manipulate, harm, or control others. The gossip's bridle sought to suppress this power by literally shutting down the offender's ability to communicate. Fitting the gossip's bridle was not a simple process. It was surprisingly bureaucratic in its application. The punishment had to be carried out in a methodical and detailed manner. Officials responsible for applying the bridle would begin by ensuring that the correct device was selected for the individual, considering factors like head size, comfort or discomfort, and security. The adjustable components meant that the device could be customized to fit the individual perfectly, ensuring that the punishment was neither too tight nor too loose. Once the bridle was secured, it was often done so with multiple locks, ensuring that the device would stay in place for the duration of the punishment. Town officials, often including blacksmiths or local craftsmen, were responsible for making sure that the device was properly applied and adjusted, making the entire process somewhat time-consuming. This aspect of the punishment reflects the bureaucratic nature of medieval justice systems, where even seemingly simple devices could require intricate preparation and execution. The public nature of this punishment was significant. Once the bridle was applied, the woman was often paraded through the streets as a symbol of the community's moral authority. Her suffering was meant to serve as both a deterrent and a reminder of the consequences of speaking out of turn. The spectacle itself was carefully orchestrated to ensure that the punishment had the desired social effect, both on the individual and the community. By making the punishment visible and public, the authorities not only sought to silence the individual, but also to reinforce the moral order of society. The bridal, with its bells and public display, often became a source of more gossip than the original offense. In effect, the punishment frequently drew more attention to the woman's behavior than it would have had she simply been left to continue her gossip. The spectacle of someone wearing the bridle, particularly with its jingling bells, became a subject of community conversation. Instead of silencing the gossip, the bridle often fueled the spread of new rumors, this time about the punishment itself. In a way, the public display of the gossip's bridle created a vicious cycle of social attention. The wearer of the bridle became the focal point of the town's curiosity, and the punishment that was supposed to silence her became the very thing that kept the gossip alive. It highlights the inherent irony of the punishment. In attempting to suppress speech, it actually encouraged more communication, albeit of a different kind. Rather than enforcing silence, the bridle reinforced the social fascination with the very behavior it was meant to control. Medieval bakers, responsible for the staple food of the community, bread, faced some of the most specific and unusual punishments for their failures in the marketplace. The medieval world placed a significant emphasis on the quality of food, particularly bread, as it was a basic necessity for survival. A baker's offense, whether selling underweight loaves, using inferior ingredients, or charging excessive prices, was considered not only a breach of professional ethics, but an affront to the community. The baker's punishment, which often involved being dragged through town on a hurdle while bad bread was burned around them, was a public and humiliating spectacle meant to remind the community of the vital importance of maintaining food quality and fair pricing. The hurdle was a crucial aspect of the punishment. This large wooden sled or frame, typically used to transport criminals to their punishments, became a means of dragging the baker through town. In many cases, the baker would be bound to the hurdle, unable to escape the humiliation of being publicly paraded through the streets. The punishment itself was not only physically uncomfortable but deeply humiliating, designed to strip the individual of their dignity in front of the community they served. The spectacle was meant to serve as a public reminder of the importance of maintaining integrity in the provision of food, something that affected every member of the community. The hurdle would be pulled through the streets by a cart or horse, dragging the baker along with it, while a crowd of onlookers could gather to watch the punishment unfold. The town's civic leaders, guild officials, and even the clergy often attended such punishments, which were designed to ensure the integrity of both the baker's profession and the market itself. The humiliation of being dragged through the streets was compounded by the fact that the baker was forced to witness the burning of the bread they had failed to properly produce. Loaves that were deemed substandard, either because they were underweight, poorly baked, or made with inferior ingredients, were taken and burned in the public square. This process symbolized the failure of the baker, not only to provide food, but to adhere to the standards set by both the guilds and the community. The bread, once the symbol of sustenance, was reduced to ash, representing the baker's failure to fulfill their role in the social and economic order. The burning of the loaves was a potent symbolic act. Bread was sacred in the medieval world. It was central to daily life and often linked to notions of provision and survival. By burning it, the authorities sent a strong message about the consequences of failing to meet the most basic expectations of food production. The punishment was designed to undermine the reputation of the baker and create a clear link between poor quality bread and public disgrace. In some cases, the baker would have to stand by while the loaves they had made were burned, adding a layer of personal humiliation. The medieval punishment system was highly regulated, and this extended even to the punishment of bakers. For the punishment to be deemed legitimate, it had to adhere to specific guidelines, and the entire process required careful organization. The hurdle itself had to be constructed to specific dimensions, according to town regulations. It needed to be sturdy enough to drag the offender through the streets without breaking, but also light enough for the town authorities to transport it with ease. Construction and maintenance of these hurdles required skilled carpenters, who often spent a significant amount of time ensuring they were in good condition. Bread verification. Before the punishment could be carried out, the bad bread had to be verified. This process involved guild officials, or designated town authorities, inspecting the loaves to ensure they were substandard. There were often strict measurements and standards for the weight of the bread, as well as regulations regarding its appearance, taste, and ingredient. Town records indicate that it was not just about the quality of the bread, but about the perception of fairness in trade. If the bread was not of a certain standard, the baker would face punishment, which could be an ongoing cycle depending on how often they failed to meet those standards. Guild involvement. The guild system added another layer of bureaucratic oversight to the punishment. In medieval towns, guilds were critical in regulating trades, and bakers were no exception. The Bakers' Guild had strict rules about the weight and quality of bread, and violators could face harsh consequences. The guild would typically be involved in verifying whether a baker had violated their standards, and this would require careful inspection and documentation. The process was not just about the baker's punishment, but about upholding the guild's reputation and the trust placed in it by the community. Guild officials had to spend time inspecting the bakery, verifying weights, and comparing the accused loaves to the agreed-upon standard. Public witnesses. The punishment was a public spectacle, and as such it had to be witnessed by officials and town residents. Medieval records indicate that often, the punishment would not occur until a sufficient crowd had gathered to witness. The purpose was not only to punish the baker, but also to use the punishment as a deterrent to others. The presence of witnesses ensured that the community saw the consequences of such actions and would be less likely to repeat the offences themselves. What made the baker's punishment particularly boring and routine was its predictability. For many bakers, being dragged through town on a hurdle and having bad bread burned was not a one-time event. It was a recurring punishment. Medieval guild records show that some bakers were punished dozens of times throughout their careers for the same offences. This made the entire punishment system a tedious cycle of offence, punishment, and eventual forgiveness. The repetitive nature of the punishment meant that bakers who repeatedly violated guild standards became familiar figures in the punishment process. Their faces became associated with bad bread, and their punishment became almost ritualistic in nature. For the community, the punishment lost its novelty, and for the baker, it became a painful, frustrating routine. Public humiliation could thus become an ongoing burden, eroding any semblance of dignity over time. The maintenance of punishment hurdles was another tedious aspect of this system. Like many medieval devices used for punishment, hurdles needed to be regularly repaired and maintained. Wooden sleds would often wear out from the repeated use, and the ropes used to drag the baker through town would fray and break. Towns employed hurdle keepers, individuals tasked with ensuring that the punishment devices were always in working order. This maintenance, although essential, became a monotonous job with little recognition. Bread was the most basic form of sustenance for the population, and bakers were responsible for ensuring that their loaves met the nutritional and economic needs of their customers. The punishment for failing to meet the most basic standards of their trade, being dragged on a hurdle while bad bread was burned, highlighted the deep economic importance of their role. This form of punishment was not just about individual failure, but about the need for community trust in the food supply. The economic ramifications of a baker's punishment were often severe. While the baker was humiliated, the community had to make do without their service. In some cases, if the punishment was particularly severe or repetitive, the baker might find it difficult to recover their reputation. The loss of trust in the baker could lead to a loss of business, and they could be banned from selling bread, leaving them financially vulnerable. While the punishment was often carried out in a highly regulated and bureaucratic manner, it also served as a reminder of the social contract between the baker, the guild, and the community. Guild officials were not only responsible for enforcing rules, but also for preserving the integrity of the profession. The baker's punishment therefore became an ongoing reminder of the moral and economic obligations that connected individuals to their trade and to their society. The guild system ensured that the punishment was administered fairly, but it also made the entire process more official and rigid. The baker's punishment was a tedious cycle of regulation, violation, and retribution. It served to enforce quality control, ensuring that bakers were held accountable for their actions. While the process itself could be seen as bureaucratic, monotonous, and repetitive, it also reflected the deeper societal need for food regulation and economic stability. For the baker, it was a constant reminder of their role within the community and the economic consequences of failure. It was a public spectacle that underscored the importance of maintaining moral and professional standards within the guild system and the larger town economy. The market pillory was a more specialized variation of the traditional pillory, specifically designed for merchants and traders who were caught engaging in commercial dishonesty. Situated at the heart of the marketplace, the market pillory was strategically placed to maximize visibility and humiliation, ensuring that the offender's punishment was not only a correction, but also a public spectacle meant to deter others from engaging in similar fraudulent behavior. The market pillory was not merely a form of retribution, it was a tool for preserving the integrity of commerce and the moral order within the town. In the medieval world, markets were the backbone of daily life. They were places where communities gathered to exchange goods, form social bonds, and engage in trade. Merchants, who were responsible for selling goods, had significant influence over the economy and the daily lives of townsfolk. Because of this, the standards by which merchants operated were incredibly important. Cheating customers, whether through false weights, adulterated food products, or inflated prices, was seen as a direct threat to the social fabric and economic stability of the community. The market pillory was used to punish a variety of commercial offences. These could include selling goods with false weights, for example, providing a customer with less product than they had paid for, such as selling apples by weight, but secretly giving a lower amount than what was advertised. Adulterating food products, such as selling watered-down milk, spoiled meat, or bread made with inferior ingredients. Charging excessive prices, either taking advantage of a monopoly in the market or exploiting times of scarcity to charge higher than reasonable prices for goods. In these cases, the punishment was not just for the fraud committed, it was a warning to the wider community about the consequences of dishonesty and the need for fairness in trade. The marketplace was where the community's trust in each other's honesty and integrity was constantly tested. Dishonesty in the market could lead to broader distrust in the entire system of trade and the cohesion of the local economy. Therefore, the market pillory was not merely a tool of individual correction, it was a public affirmation of the need for honesty and fairness in commerce. What made the market pillory particularly tedious and bureaucratic was the elaborate process involved in proving commercial fraud. Unlike some forms of punishment where guilt could be determined relatively quickly, the market pillory required that multiple layers of investigation, documentation, and verification take place before the punishment could be carried out. Verification of the offense. The offense had to be verified through witnesses. Medieval town officials or members of the guilds had the job of monitoring the behavior of merchants to ensure they adhered to fair practices. They would investigate complaints from customers or rival traders, examining the merchants' goods and comparing their prices or weights to see if they were in compliance with the rules. This process was often slow and required numerous witnesses, including customers, other merchants, and local officials, who had to gather evidence to prove that a fraud had been committed. Guild involvement. The guild system played a central role in the enforcement of market rules, and many medieval markets were governed by strict guild regulations. Merchants belonged to specific guilds that set standards for pricing, product quality, and fair trading practice. When an offense occurred, guild officials had to verify the quality of the goods in question. This could involve inspecting the merchant's scales or weighing a sample of the product. The merchant could not be punished without proper documentation and verification from guild members. This verification process could take days, depending on the complexity of the offense and the number of witnesses required. Public witnessing of the evidence. Once an offense had been confirmed, the evidence of the fraud was often displayed alongside the pillory. For example, the faulty goods, whether underweight loaves of bread, improperly measured sacks of grain, or adulterated meat, would be displayed for the public to see. This was meant to not only shame the offender, but also educate the community about the dishonest practices that were occurring in the market. The public display was part of the punitive spectacle, where the community was given the opportunity to witness justice being served. Witnessing the punishment. In many cases, the punishment itself was not carried out until a sufficient number of people were gathered to witness the event. Unlike more private forms of punishment, the market pillory was inherently public. The entire process was designed to humiliate the offender, making them an example for others who might be tempted to engage in similar behavior. Town criers or other local officials would often announce the punishment in advance to ensure that the maximum number of people would be present to witness it. The market pillory was often a more sophisticated structure compared to other forms of public punishment, like the stocks or regular pillories. It was typically designed to be a prominent feature in the marketplace, where it would be easily visible to all. Some market pillories featured adjustable components, including locking mechanisms that could secure the offender in place and prevent them from escaping. More elaborate versions of the pillory included scales or measuring devices that could be attached to the structure. These devices were used to display the offense. For example, a false scale or faulty weights could be hung from the pillory alongside the merchant to show the crime that had been committed. The presence of these measuring instruments further emphasized the connection between the merchant's offense and their profession, reinforcing the idea that their dishonesty was an affront to the very trade they represent. In some cases, the pillory itself was highly decorative, often made of finely carved wood or featuring inscriptions that underscored the moral purpose of the punishment. These carvings could include religious symbols, moral sayings, or other messages designed to remind both the offender and the community of the social and legal order. The decorative aspects made the pillory both a functional device and a symbol of civic pride, reminding townspeople of the rules they were expected to follow. One of the key features of the market pillory was its routine nature. Since the medieval marketplace was an intensely regulated space, merchants were regularly monitored for compliance with pricing, weights, and product quality. The market pillory, therefore, became a common feature in market life. For merchants who routinely broke the rules, being sentenced to the pillory became a predictable event, one that could happen multiple times over the course of their careers. The predictable nature of the punishment made it less effective as a deterrent over time. Townsfolk became accustomed to seeing merchants in the pillory, and the spectacle of public humiliation often lost its power. In some ways, it became a routine part of market life, like the ringing of the town bell or the opening of market stalls. Customers and traders alike would pass by the pillory without much thought, barely noticing when a merchant was punished for their latest transgression. Additionally, the fact that the market pillory was so frequently used meant that it required constant maintenance. Much like other public punishment devices, the pillory had to be regularly repaired and checked for wear. Wooden structures could rot or splinter over time, and metal locks could rust or become unusable. The town officials responsible for maintaining the pillory were tasked with ensuring that it was always in working order, and these officials had to regularly assess whether the pillory needed repairs or upgrades. This administrative process, although vital, was often tedious and underappreciated. The market pillory was as much about public spectacle as it was about justice. The pillory was not just a means of punishment, it was a tool for social control and moral reinforcement. By displaying the offending merchant in the pillory, townspeople were reminded that there were consequences for dishonesty in commerce. This public exposure was meant to ensure that merchants followed the rules and treated their customers fairly, or face the ridicule and scorn of the entire community. Over time, the market pillory became less about the specific punishment of an individual and more about its role in maintaining order in the marketplace. It served as a reminder that the market was a space governed by fairness and that unfair trade could not be tolerated. The market pillory was thus an instrument not just for personal punishment, but for reaffirming the collective values of the town, values that upheld fairness, honesty, and social order. The thew was one of the more unusual medieval punishment devices, primarily designed to enforce labor discipline by punishing laziness, negligence, or failure to meet work standards in servants, laborers, and work. Unlike many other forms of punishment in medieval times, which targeted moral or criminal offenses, the thew was aimed at workplace behavior, specifically targeting the individual's inability or unwillingness to work diligently. It was a punishment that primarily affected those in the service or labor sector, such as household servants, manual laborers, or even apprentices. Its design and implementation reflect how medieval society used punishment, not only to correct criminal activity, but also to ensure productivity and maintain social order within the workforce. The thew was a wooden collar, often attached to chains, that restrained the wearer from resting or lying down. The collar was typically fastened securely around the neck, and the chains were designed to prevent the wearer from sitting or lying down comfortably, which was the point of the punishment. In essence, the thew served as a tool to make sure the person remained active and alert at all times. For workers or servants who were accused of being lazy or neglectful in their duties, the thew was intended to be a constant reminder of their responsibility to stay focused on their tasks. One of the key features of the thew was its restrictive nature. The chains were not just for display, they physically impeded the wearer's movement, often forcing them into a state of uncomfortably forced activity. In many cases, the design would prevent the wearer from performing any task that required them to sit or lie down, thereby forcing them to remain standing or walking for extended periods. This made it not just a punishment, but a form of exhaustive labor, as the individual would be unable to find relief or rest. Some versions of the thew were simple, consisting of a basic wooden collar attached to chains. Others, however, were more elaborate. Some had adjustable components to fit different body sizes, ensuring that they would be uncomfortable for the wearer no matter their physique. More intricate versions of the thew included small bells, which would ring every time the wearer moved their head, alerting authorities or passers-by to the wearer's non-compliance with the punishment. These bells were designed not only for practical purposes, such as making sure the person didn't rest, but also to further humiliate the wearer in public by creating an auditory signal of their failure. The most basic thew were focused entirely on discomfort and restriction, with little to no decorative elements. However, even these simpler designs served their purpose to ensure the constant physical discomfort of the wearer, thereby deterring rest and forcing them to engage in whatever work was expected of them without relief. The thew was rooted in medieval society's deeply ingrained work ethic, where labor was seen as not just a means of survival but a moral obligation. For servants and workers, failing to meet work standards could be seen as an affront to the social order and their responsibilities within the household or town. In an era where manual labor was the backbone of the economy, ensuring that individuals worked diligently was considered essential for maintaining both economic productivity and social stability. The medieval mindset toward work often included the notion that idleness or failure to labor diligently was both a personal failing and a moral transgression. People who were accused of laziness or negligence were often not just seen as inefficient, they were regarded as a threat to the collective prosperity and well-being of the community. In many ways, the thew's design as a punishment was symbolic of this harsh belief. Those who shirked their duties were to be physically constrained, forced into constant activity, and reminded through discomfort of their duty to labor. What made the thew particularly tedious was the bureaucratic process that surrounded its application. The punishment was not handed out arbitrarily. It required careful documentation of the offense, and the process of determining whether the person should be punished was often methodical and drawn out. Medieval employers or authorities had to document precisely what the worker was accused of, and how much work was expected, Labour standards had to be clearly defined, and employers had to prove that the accused had failed to meet these standards before the punishment could be administered. Establishing work standards. One of the more complex aspects of applying the theory was the need for documentation of labour standards. Medieval records indicate that employers often had to establish exact expectations of what constituted proper work, which could vary based on the specific task or job. For instance, a servant might be expected to clean a certain number of rooms per day, while a labourer could be required to work a specific number of hours or complete a set amount of physical tasks. This was not always easy to quantify, and disputes often arose regarding whether the accused had indeed failed to meet expectations. Witnesses and verification. The process often involved multiple witnesses, from fellow workers to other town residents, who could testify to the individual's alleged laziness. Town officials or employers had to verify the accusations through these witnesses before the punishment was applied. This created a bureaucratic process that was more detailed than one might expect for such a seemingly simple punishment. Not only did the accusation have to be substantiated, but the punishment's duration and severity were often left to be determined by the employer or local official. Fitting an application. Once the offence had been verified and the worker's failure documented, the fitting of the theory could begin. The collar had to be properly adjusted, making the process more time-consuming than it might appear. The fitting ensured that the device would create the maximum discomfort for the individual while still allowing them to perform basic work duty. Officials, along with the employer, had to ensure the theory was properly secured, which meant fitting it snugly around the neck and ensuring the chains were attached correctly. Public exposure. While the theory's focus was on forcing the wearer to remain active, it was also a public punishment. The public exposure served as a way to humiliate the offender in front of their peers, especially if they were servants or workers within the community. People could see the individual struggling under the weight of the device, constantly reminded of their perceived failure to meet work standards. This exposure added another layer of discomfort to the already physically restricting nature of the punishment. The primary psychological impact of the theory was the constant discomfort and mental strain of being forced to stay active and avoid resting for an extended period. The device physically restricted the wearer from sitting or lying down, which was particularly challenging if the task required any sort of fine motor skills or prolonged physical labor. As such, the theory had the dual effect of keeping the offender physically uncomfortable and mentally exhausted. The forced activity turned the punishment into a continuous reminder of their failure, preventing the wearer from escaping the shame of their perceived negligence. The physical toll of the theory, especially when worn for extended periods, was also significant. The wearer could experience muscle fatigue and joint strain from being forced to stand or walk, without the ability to rest. The discomfort became compounded by the psychological toll of having to endure a punishment that restricted natural body movement. The absence of a restful position made this punishment particularly grueling, turning what should have been a normal day of work into a long, monotonous ordeal. What made the theory particularly boring and grinding was its long-term nature. While some punishments were short-term and focused on delivering quick consequences, the theory created an endless cycle of discomfort that could drag on for days or even weeks. Unlike punishments that allowed for intermittent rest or relief, the theory required the person to remain constantly active and alert, with no moments of respite. This long duration meant that the punishment affected not just the individual's physical health, but their mental well-being as well. Over time, the repetitive nature of the punishment wore down the offender's resolve, potentially leading to feelings of hopelessness or exhaustion. The punishment, in essence, became a test of endurance, with the wearer forced to contend with their own discomfort, day in and day out. The jargs was a punishment device used predominantly in medieval Scotland, designed to restrain individuals for minor offences. Often constructed as an iron collar attached to a wall, post or pillar, the jargs were primarily used for moral offences, such as adultery, theft, drunkenness, and other socially frowned upon actions. The jugs were simple in design yet incredibly effective at inflicting public humiliation, which was the central objective of this form of punishment. The punishment served as both a form of restraint and a social lesson, reinforcing the moral standards of the community and reminding everyone of the consequences of violating them. The jugs were essentially iron collars that fit around the neck of the offender, with one end of the collar attached to a stationary structure, such as a wall or post. This structure was often placed in a highly visible public area, such as the marketplace, churchyard or town square, where large crowds would gather. By being tethered to an immovable object, the individual could not move freely or escape their confinement, making them a public spectacle. While the construction of the jugs was relatively simple, it was designed to make the offender sufficiently uncomfortable, while still allowing them to endure the punishment for several hours. The iron collar was typically locked around the person's neck, making it difficult to remove without the assistance of a key, which would typically be held by town officials. Some jugs were more elaborate, featuring decorative engravings or additional attachments, designed to emphasize the offender's shame. These embellishments might include religious symbols or moral inscriptions, underscoring the moral intent behind the punishment. The primary function of the jugs was to restrict movement. The individual was forced to remain in place for the duration of the punishment. In most cases, the offender was restrained for several hours, and the collar prevented them from escaping or moving freely. The public nature of the punishment ensured that the person's disgrace would be witnessed by as many people as possible, with the hope that the display would act as a deterrent for others. In medieval Scotland, the jugs served as a reminder of the importance of moral behavior and social order. This punishment device was used for relatively minor offenses, often related to public morality, and it functioned within a broader framework of social control. The medieval Scots had strict codes of conduct, both religious and civic, and deviations from the accepted moral code were considered disruptive to the harmony of the community. The moral offenses punished by the jugs included adultery, theft, drunkenness, and sometimes even blasphemy or insubordination to local authorities. These were seen not only as personal failings, but as behaviors that could have negative repercussions for the community as a whole. Adultery, for instance, was seen as a violation of marital sanctity, while theft and drunkenness were offenses that could undermine trust and order within the community. By enforcing the use of the jugs, the authorities sought to maintain the moral integrity of the town, publicly demonstrating that these actions would not be tolerated. The process surrounding the application of the jugs was surprisingly bureaucratic. The use of the jugs was not simply a matter of local officials deciding to restrain an individual on a whim. Instead, there were specific rules and regulations that determined when and how the jugs could be used. This required detailed documentation and verification of the offense before the punishment could be applied. Verification of offense. In medieval Scotland, as in other parts of Europe, offences had to be carefully verified before any punishment could be enforced. The local authorities, including the church and town officials, would often rely on witnesses to confirm that the accused had committed the offence. For example, in cases of adultery, witnesses would be required to testify to the fact, as direct evidence was often difficult to come by. In some cases, the accused person's confession might be required. The need for documentation of the crime ensured that the process was methodical, though not necessarily swift. Determining punishment duration. Once the crime had been verified, the duration of the punishment was determined. The time spent in the jugs was typically measured in hours, though in some cases it could last longer, depending on the severity of the offence and the decision of the local authority. Church or civil authorities often played a role in setting the terms for the punishment, ensuring that it was in line with the community's moral standard. Public supervision. The process was also supervised by local officials or community leaders, who ensured that the punishment was carried out properly. The officials responsible for overseeing the jugs would also have to ensure that the duration was adhered to, and the individual remained in place for the prescribed period. The documentation of the punishment was often added to town or church records, which would include information about the individual's crime, the nature of the punishment, and the duration. The jugs were particularly tedious because they involved passive restraint. Unlike more physically demanding punishments, such as flogging or hard labor, The jugs required the individual to remain stationary for an extended period. This created a monotonous experience for both the offender and the authorities monitoring the punishment. While the offender could engage in minimal movement, they were still restricted by the collar, and their ability to interact with others was limited. The mental toll of the jugs, while not physically painful, was often grueling. Being confined to a post or wall for several hours in a public space, with the constant exposure to the eyes of others, caused great embarrassment and shame. The lack of physical activity during the punishment made the experience feel like an endless waiting game, with the individual forced to endure the awkwardness and discomfort of being seen by all. The humiliation was part of the punishment, ensuring that the offender did not only suffer in a physical sense, but was also mentally burdened by the awareness that they were being publicly shamed. One of the key aspects of the jugs was its ability to turn the punishment into a public spectacle. Public punishment was a common tool of social control in medieval societies, as it allowed authorities to reinforce the idea that transgressions against the moral order would not be tolerated. The jugs ensured that the community could witness the consequences of immoral behavior, and this public display was intended to act as a deterrent to others. The humiliation of being confined to the jugs made it clear to the community that unacceptable behavior would result in consequence. Whether it was adultery, theft, or public drunkenness, the jugs were used as a way to send a strong social message about the importance of adhering to the moral standards of the time. The spectacle also allowed the community to play a part in maintaining order, as onlookers could witness the punishment and judge the transgressions of the offender. Over time, the jugs became a routine part of life in medieval Scottish towns. While initially seen as an effective form of public punishment, its frequent use turned it into a predictable event. Many individuals in smaller towns or villages likely faced the jugs multiple times throughout their life. It became somewhat mundane, both for those being punished and for those observing the spectacle. Despite its ability to humiliate, the jugs lost some of its power as a deterrent when it became a regular occurrence. Townspeople may have come to expect the jugs to be used as a corrective tool for minor offences, and the predictable nature of its application made it less impactful over time. The routine of public humiliation became just another part of town life, albeit one that still carried significant social consequences for the individual who was punished. The barrel shirt was one of the more absurd and humiliating punishment devices used in medieval times, designed primarily to publicly shame individuals who committed moral offences. Unlike the drunkard's cloak, a punishment where the individual was forced to wear an entire cloak made of straw, the barrel shirt was a much more restrictive and suffocating device. It consisted of a wooden barrel with holes cut out for the head and arms, creating a barrier to comfort that not only prevented the wearer from performing their usual activities, but also ensured that they were humiliated in a highly visible manner. While its design and use were often tied to specific moral transgressions, the barrel shirt's use as a form of long-term public humiliation also reflected the medieval view that punishment was as much about spectacle as it was about actual correction. Those who were condemned to wear the barrel shirt had to endure its restrictive nature while continuing their daily routines, forced to live out their punishment in the eyes of their community. The construction of the barrel shirt was relatively straightforward, though surprisingly sophisticated for a punishment device. The barrel itself was made of wood, typically crafted by coopers, the same tradesmen who made barrels for wine, ale, and other goods. The barrel had several holes cut out for the head and arms, making it wearable, but this was not its only purpose. The design of the barrel shirt was meant to ensure that the wearer could not escape discomfort, regardless of what they were doing. Comfort, restriction. Unlike other punishments that focused on immobilizing the body, like stocks or pillories, the barrel shirt restricted natural movement. The person wearing it was forced to continue their activities, but the physical discomfort of being confined to a heavy, awkward barrel made almost every movement an exertion. Whether a person was trying to work, socialize, or simply go about their business, the barrel shirt made it impossible to function normally. The wearer's ability to work, interact with others, or even move freely was severely impaired. Long-term humiliation, The punishment could last for weeks or even months, making it particularly tedious and psychologically damaging. Unlike punishments that were completed within a few hours, the barrel shirt required the offender to endure public ridicule for a long period. They had to continue their daily life while wearing the barrel, making it a long-term spectacle that everyone in the community could witness. This extended form of public exposure was meant to ensure that the individual never forgot their offense and never regained full dignity. Adjustable components. Some versions of the barrel shirt had adjustable elements designed to increase discomfort. These included small metal fixtures or locks that secured the barrel tightly around the wearer's body. These adjustments could make the punishment more restrictive or uncomfortable, depending on the severity of the crime. The weight of the barrel could also vary, depending on how much the authorities wanted to make the punishment more physically exhausting. Signs or symbols. Some barrel shirts were decorated or marked with symbols that indicated the offender's crime. These inscriptions often served as a form of branding, publicly labeling the individual's transgression for all to see. In some cases, these symbols were engraved directly onto the barrel, but in others, they might have been written on signs or small placards hung around the offender's neck. For example, someone who committed adultery might have a red cross painted on the barrel, while a thief might wear a barrel adorned with a thief's symbol. This branding was a way of increasing the humiliation, as it made the person's offense visible to anyone they encountered. The use of the barrel shirt was closely tied to moral codes in medieval society, which were heavily influenced by religious beliefs and the desire to maintain social order. Crimes such as adultery, theft, and other forms of immorality were viewed not only as personal failings, but also as disruptions to the moral fabric of the community. The medieval world had strong codes of conduct, especially regarding family honor, marital fidelity, and public behavior. In this context, the barrel shirt was meant to force public accountability for actions that were seen as undermining the moral integrity of society. For offenses like adultery or theft, the barrel shirt served as a visual warning to others in the community, showing them that transgressions would be publicly punished and that those who violated social norms would be held accountable. It was not enough to simply punish an individual in private. The public spectacle was crucial to ensuring that the punishment acted as a deterrent. The fact that individuals who were punished with the barrel shirt had to continue their regular activities while wearing it reflected a societal belief that moral failings should be dealt with openly and publicly. This approach ensured that the offender was unable to escape the consequences of their action. Whether they were attending religious services, socializing at public events, or working in the marketplace, the barrel shirt forced the wearer to endure constant public reminder of their crime, thus reinforcing the moral standards of the community. Like many medieval punishments, the application of the barrel shirt was subject to a bureaucratic process that ensured the punishment was legitimate and properly enforced. There were officials who would need to verify that the offense had indeed occurred, often requiring witnesses and documentation before the punishment could be carried out. Verification of the crime. The crime had to be documented, and the offender's guilt had to be verified by witnesses. In many cases, local authorities would rely on the testimony of community members or official reports from the church. This process ensured that the barrel shirt was only used for individuals who had been proven to have committed offenses, such as adultery, theft, or other moral transgression. Determining the duration. The duration of the punishment was often decided by local authorities or church officials, based on the nature of the crime and the offender's social status. The barrel shirt might be worn for a set number of weeks, with the individual's behavior often closely monitored during that time. In some cases, the barrel shirt could be worn for months, and in rare instances, for even longer periods. The long duration ensured that the punishment was more than just a temporary discomfort. It became a prolonged public ordeal. Supervision and enforcement. Town or church officials were responsible for ensuring that the barrel shirt was worn properly and for the right duration. The bureaucratic aspect of applying the punishment meant that it wasn't just about physical restraint. It also required careful supervision to ensure the punishment was carried out according to the local laws or moral codes. This often involved official records that documented the offender's progress and ensured that the punishment was completed. The psychological toll of wearing the barrel shirt was likely severe, as the individual was forced to endure constant public shame. The humiliation was compounded by the inability to escape the discomfort and the incessant exposure to the judgment of the community. Whether they were attending religious services, shopping in the market, or running errands, the individual was forced to do so while constantly reminded of their moral failure. The physical toll was also significant. The barrel shirt was designed to be restrictive and uncomfortable, and wearing it for extended periods meant that the individual was unable to rest or perform their normal activities without discomfort. The added weight of the barrel would put strain on the wearer's body, causing fatigue and muscle strain from carrying it around. The discomfort and isolation caused by the barrel shirt would likely have contributed to mental exhaustion. As what made the barrel shirt particularly boring was the routine nature of the punishment. Unlike some punishments that lasted only a few hours or days, the barrel shirt was a long-term punishment. For weeks or months, the offender was forced to endure public humiliation, restricted movement, and physical discomfort. Medieval records describe how the punishment could feel like a long, monotonous cycle, where the individual's life became focused on surviving the discomfort and enduring the public spectacle. The monotony of wearing the barrel shirt made the punishment more than just a physical ordeal. It became a psychological burden. The finger pillory was a miniature version of the standard pillory, designed specifically to restrain individual fingers as punishment for minor offense. This device was remarkably precise in its construction and application. The finger pillory was used primarily for minor theft, particularly pickpocketing and similar offenses involving the hands. What made this punishment particularly tedious was the elaborate process of determining which fingers were involved in the offense. Medieval authorities had to establish exact evidence of hand-based crimes and document the specific digits used. The construction of finger pillories was surprisingly sophisticated. Many featured adjustable components, individual restraints for each finger, and even small mechanisms that would apply pressure to specific digits. The most elaborate finger pillories were works of fine craftsmanship, with intricate construction and decorative elements that made the punishment as much about display as restraint. Medieval records show that finger pillories were often used for remarkably minor offense. An individual might be sentenced to the finger pillory for stealing a few coins, or for touching someone else's property without permission. The punishment typically lasted several hours, during which the individual would be unable to use their hands and would serve as a warning to others. The process of applying a finger pillory was incredibly methodical. The individual's offense had to be verified by multiple witnesses, the appropriate fingers had to be identified and documented, and the entire process had to be supervised by local officials. Often, the bureaucratic process took longer than the actual punishment. What made finger pillories particularly boring was their precision. Unlike other punishments that affected the entire body, the finger pillory targeted specific digits, creating a highly focused but monotonous punishment that affected the individual's ability to perform manual tasks. The neck violin was a punishment device consisting of a wooden board with holes cut for the head and hands, shaped roughly like a violin. This device was used primarily for minor moral offenses, and was designed to create maximum humiliation with minimal physical harm. The neck violin was used for a wide variety of minor offenses, including public arguing, minor theft, and moral violations. What made this punishment particularly absurd was the elaborate process of determining appropriate punishment set. Medieval authorities had to establish exact specifications for the violin's construction and decoration. The construction of neck violins was surprisingly artistic. Many featured elaborate decorative elements, carved details, and even painted scenes that would illustrate the wearer's effect. The most elaborate neck violins were works of woodcraft, with intricate construction and decorative elements that made the punishment as much about display as restraint. Medieval records show that neck violins were often used for surprisingly specific offenses. An individual might be sentenced to wear the neck violin for arguing with a neighbor, or for engaging in inappropriate behavior at a public gathering. The punishment typically lasted several hours, during which the individual would be unable to move freely and would serve as a warning to others. The process of fitting a neck file in was incredibly detailed. The device had to be properly sized to the individual's body, adjusted for the correct level of discomfort, and secured with multiple locks. Town officials would often spend considerable time ensuring the neck file-in was applied correctly, making the entire process tediously bureaucratic. What made neck file-ins particularly boring was their decorative nature. Unlike other punishments that focused purely on restraint, the neck file-in was designed to be visually interesting, creating a punishment that was as much about art as just. Medieval accounts described the mind-numbing process of commissioning and constructing custom neck file-ins for specific offences. The drunkard's helmet was a specialized punishment device consisting of a metal helmet with holes that would allow beer or wine to pour over the wearer's head. This device was used specifically for individuals guilty of excessive drinking. The drunkard's helmet was designed to create a constant reminder of the individual's offense, while also providing a form of public humiliation. What made this punishment particularly absurd was the elaborate process of determining appropriate liquid quantities. Medieval authorities had to establish exact specifications for the amount and type of alcohol used. The construction of drunkards' helmets was surprisingly sophisticated. Many featured adjustable components, drainage systems, and even small reservoirs that would control the flow of liquid. The most elaborate drunkards' helmets were works of metalcraft, with intricate construction and decorative elements that made the punishment as much about display as discomfort. Medieval records show that drunkards' helmets were often used for remarkably specific drinking offences. An individual might be sentenced to wear the helmet for drinking during inappropriate hours, or for consuming alcohol in prohibited locations. The punishment typically lasted several hours, during which the individual would be unable to see clearly and would serve as a warning to others. The process of fitting a drunkard's helmet was incredibly methodical. The device had to be properly sized to the individual's head, adjusted for the correct level of discomfort, and filled with the appropriate amount of liquid. Town officials would often spend considerable time ensuring the helmet was applied correctly, making the entire process tediously bureaucratic. What made drunkards' helmets particularly boring was their maintenance requirement. The helmets had to be cleaned regularly, the liquid had to be replenished, and the entire system had to be monitored for proper function. Medieval towns employed helmet keepers whose job was to ensure these devices remained in proper working order. The shame mask was a punishment device consisting of a metal mask designed to resemble the face of an animal or demon, worn by individuals guilty of various moral offences. These masks were designed to create maximum humiliation, while also serving as a form of public theatre. The shame mask was used for a wide variety of moral offences, including adultery, theft, and public misbehavior. What made this punishment particularly elaborate was the process of determining appropriate mask design. Medieval authorities had to establish exact specifications for mask construction and decoration, based on the specific offence. The construction of shame masks was surprisingly artistic. Many featured elaborate decorative elements, carved details, and even movable parts that would enhance the theatrical effect. The most elaborate shame masks were works of metal craft and artistry, with intricate construction and decorative elements that made the punishment as much about performance as humiliation. Medieval records show that shame masks were often used for remarkably specific offences. An individual might be sentenced to wear a pig mask for gluttony, or a demon mask for moral violations. The punishment typically lasted several hours, during which the individual would be paraded through town and would serve as a warning to others. The process of fitting a shame mask was incredibly detailed. The device had to be properly sized to the individual's head, adjusted for the correct level of visibility and breathing, and secured with multiple locks. Town officials would often spend considerable time ensuring the mask was applied correctly, making the entire process tediously bureaucratic. What made shame masks particularly boring was their theatrical nature. Unlike other punishments that focused purely on restraint, the shame mask was designed to be entertaining, creating a punishment that was as much about community theatre as just. Medieval accounts describe the mind-numbing process of commissioning and constructing custom masks for specific offences. The walking shame was a punishment that required individuals to walk through town while carrying signs or wearing symbols that advertised their offence. This punishment was designed to create maximum public awareness, while also providing exercise and activity. The walking shame was used for a wide variety of offences, including minor theft, moral violations, and commercial fraud. What made this punishment particularly tedious was the elaborate process of determining appropriate walking routes. Medieval authorities had to establish exact specifications for the path through town and the duration of the walk. The construction of walking shame implements was surprisingly varied. Many featured elaborate signs, symbols, and even small bells or noisemakers that would announce the individual's presence. The most elaborate walking shame punishments were works of craftsmanship, with intricate signs and decorative elements that made the punishment as much about display as exercise. Medieval records show that walking shame punishments were often used for remarkably specific offences. An individual might be sentenced to walk through town, carrying a sign advertising their theft, or wearing a symbol that identified their moral violation. The punishment typically lasted several hours, during which the individual would be unable to conduct normal business and would serve as a warning to others. The process of organizing a walking shame was incredibly methodical. The individual's offense had to be verified by multiple witnesses, the appropriate signs had to be constructed, and the entire process had to be supervised by local officials. Often the bureaucratic process took longer than the actual punishment. What made walking shame particularly boring was its routine nature. Medieval towns were small communities where everyone knew everyone else, and the walking shame punishment was used so frequently that it became a mundane part of daily life. Medieval accounts described the mind-numbing routine of daily shame walks through familiar streets. This punishment was designed to create maximum public humiliation while also providing entertainment for the community. Carting was used for a wide variety of offences, including adultery, theft, and public misbehavior. What made this punishment particularly elaborate was the process of determining appropriate cart construction. Medieval authorities had to establish exact specifications for cart size, decoration, and the route through town. The construction of punishment carts was surprisingly sophisticated. Many featured raised platforms, decorative elements, and even small stages that would enhance the theatrical effect. The most elaborate punishment carts were works of craftsmanship, with intricate construction and decorative elements that made the punishment as much about performance as humiliation. Medieval records show that carting punishments were often used for remarkably specific offences. An individual might be sentenced to carting for adultery, with the cart decorated with symbols of their offence. The punishment typically lasted several hours, during which the individual would be paraded through town and would serve as a warning to others. The process of organising a carting was incredibly detailed. The individual's offence had to be verified by multiple witnesses, the appropriate cart had to be constructed or prepared, and the entire process had to be supervised by local officials. Often the bureaucratic process took longer than the actual punishment. What made carting particularly boring was its predictable nature. Medieval communities were highly regulated environments, and carting was used so frequently that it became a routine part of community life. Medieval accounts describe the mind-numbing routine of regular carting processions through familiar streets. These punishments were designed to be productive while also serving as a form of public humiliation. Community service punishments were used for a wide variety of offences, including minor theft, moral violations, and public misbehavior. What made these punishments particularly tedious was the elaborate process of determining appropriate tasks. Medieval authorities had to establish exact specifications for the work required and the duration of the service. The organization of community service punishments was surprisingly complex. Many required specific tools, materials, and supervision, creating elaborate systems of punishment and administration. The most boring community service punishments were repetitive tasks, like street cleaning, wall repair, and waste management. Medieval records show that community service punishments were often used for remarkably minor offences. An individual might be sentenced to clean the town square for stealing a loaf of bread, or repair public buildings for minor moral violation. The punishment typically lasted several days or weeks, during which the individual would be unable to conduct normal business and would serve as a warning to others. The process of organizing community service was incredibly methodical. The individual's offense had to be verified by multiple witnesses, the appropriate work had to be identified and planned, and the entire process had to be supervised by local officials. Often the bureaucratic process took longer than the actual punishment. What made community service punishments particularly boring was their productive nature. Unlike other punishments that focused purely on humiliation, community service was designed to benefit the community, creating a punishment that was as much about utility as justice. Medieval accounts described the mind-numbing routine of daily community service tasks. Winter punishments had to account for cold weather, while summer punishments required consideration of heat and humidity. During winter months, many outdoor punishments became impractical or dangerous. The ducking stool couldn't be used when ponds were frozen, and stocks became instruments of potential death rather than humiliation. Medieval authorities developed elaborate indoor alternatives, including heated punishment chambers and covered pillory. Spring brought its own challenges to medieval justice. The annual renewal of community life meant that punishment devices had to be inspected, repaired, and often rebuilt after winter damage. Town records show extensive discussions about the proper timing of punishment repairs and the allocation of resources for justice maintenance. Summer punishments required careful consideration of heat and sun exposure. Many punishment devices were modified with canopies or shade structures, and the timing of punishments was adjusted to avoid the hottest parts of the day. Medieval authorities developed detailed protocols for summer justice administration. Autumn was traditionally the season for major punishments, as communities prepared for winter and sought to resolve outstanding justice issues. The harvest season provided both the resources and the community attention necessary for elaborate punishment ceremonies. What made seasonal punishment variations particularly boring was their predictable nature. Medieval communities developed highly routinized approaches to seasonal justice, with the same types of punishments occurring at the same times each year. The bureaucratic planning required for seasonal punishment administration was mind-numbingly detailed and repetitive. Medieval communities developed specialized guilds dedicated to the maintenance and operation of punishment devices. These guilds were among the most boring professional organizations in medieval society, focused entirely on the technical aspects of justice administration. The punishment maintenance guilds were responsible for ensuring that all justice devices remained in proper working order. This included regular inspections, repairs, and replacements of worn components. Guild members developed highly specialized skills in woodworking, metalworking, and rope construction specific to punishment devices. Guild records show incredibly detailed documentation of punishment device maintenance. Every repair, replacement, and modification was carefully recorded, creating archives of mind-numbing technical information about medieval justice equipment. These records provide insight into the surprisingly complex world of punishment administration. The training required to become a punishment maintenance guild member was extensive and tedious. Apprentices spent years learning the proper construction techniques for various devices, the appropriate materials for different climates, and the correct procedures for device operation and maintenance. What made punishment maintenance guilds particularly boring was their focus on technical precision rather than justice outcome. Guild members were primarily concerned with ensuring that devices functioned correctly, regardless of the appropriateness or effectiveness of the punishments they enabled. The guild system also created elaborate hierarchies within punishment administration. Master craftsmen supervised apprentices, guild officials coordinated with town authorities, and specialized experts handled particularly complex devices. This bureaucratic structure made medieval justice administration remarkably complex and tedious. Medieval communities maintained extensive records of punishment administration, creating archives of justice that were remarkable for their boring attention to detail. These records provide insight into the surprisingly bureaucratic nature of medieval justice. Punishment records included detailed descriptions of offenses, the specific devices used, the duration of punishments, and the outcomes achieved. Scribes developed standardized forms for different types of punishments, creating uniform documentation across different communities and time periods. The record-keeping process was incredibly tedious, requiring multiple witnesses to verify each aspect of the punishment. Officials had to document the condition of punishment devices, the weather during outdoor punishments, and even the reactions of community members observing the proceeding. Medieval punishment records also included extensive financial documentation. Communities tracked the costs of punishment device discussion and maintenance, the wages paid to officials and guards, and even the value of objects thrown at people in stocks or pillory. What made punishment record-keeping particularly boring was its comprehensive nature. Medieval scribes documented every aspect of justice administration, creating archives that were exhaustive in their detail, but mind-numbing in their mundane focus on procedural compliance. The preservation of punishment records was also a significant undertaking. Medieval communities invested considerable resources in maintaining archives, protecting documents from weather and pests, and ensuring that records remained accessible for future reference. Medieval communities often attracted visitors who came specifically to observe punishment proceedings, creating a form of justice tourism that was both economically important and socially complex. This phenomenon added another layer of bureaucracy to medieval punishment administration. Punishment tourism required communities to accommodate visitors, provide viewing areas, and manage crowds during popular punishment events. Towns developed elaborate protocols for managing punishment spectacles, including designated viewing areas, crowd control measures, and even refreshment sales. The economic impact of punishment tourism was significant for many medieval communities. Visitors required lodging, food, and entertainment, creating a secondary economy around justice administration. Towns competed to attract punishment tourists by developing more elaborate and entertaining punishment spectacles. Medieval records show that punishment tourism was often more popular than the actual justice outcomes warranted. Communities would advertise upcoming punishments, coordinate with neighboring towns to avoid scheduling conflicts, and even delay punishments to accommodate visitor schedules. What made punishment tourism particularly boring was its routine nature. Medieval communities developed highly predictable patterns of punishment entertainment, with the same types of spectacles occurring at regular intervals. The bureaucratic planning required for punishment tourism was mind-numbingly detailed and repetitive. The social dynamics of punishment tourism also created complex relationships between communities. Towns that hosted popular punishment events gained prestige and economic benefits, while communities with less entertaining justice systems struggled to maintain their social standing. Medieval punishment methods evolved slowly over time, with communities gradually adopting new techniques and abandoning others based on their effectiveness and practicality. This evolutionary process was remarkably boring in its incremental nature. The development of new punishment methods was typically driven by practical considerations, rather than innovations in justice theory. Communities modified existing devices to address specific problems, such as escape attempts or equipment failures, rather than developing entirely new approaches to punishment. Medieval records show that punishment evolution was heavily influenced by resource availability and technical capabilities. Communities with skilled craftsmen developed more sophisticated punishment devices, while areas with limited resources maintained simpler, more traditional methods. The adoption of new punishment methods was also influenced by communication between communities. Towns shared information about effective punishments, leading to the gradual spread of successful techniques across regions. This process was slow and often took decades or centuries to complete. What made punishment evolution particularly boring was its conservative nature. Medieval communities were reluctant to abandon traditional methods, even when more effective alternatives were available. The bureaucratic processes required to approve new punishment methods were incredibly slow and resistant to change. The documentation of punishment evolution provides insight into the surprisingly methodical approach medieval communities took to justice administration. Changes were carefully planned, extensively tested, and thoroughly documented before being implemented. Medieval punishment philosophy was based on concepts of public humiliation, community involvement, and restorative justice that were quite different from modern approaches. These philosophical foundations created punishment systems that were remarkably boring in their emphasis on social conformity. The medieval approach to punishment was primarily focused on reintegrating offenders into the community rather than isolating them from society. Most punishments were designed to allow offenders to continue living and working in the community while serving as visible examples of the consequences of deviant behavior. Medieval justice philosophy also emphasized the importance of community participation in punishment administration. Punishments were designed to involve as many community members as possible, both as witnesses and as participants in the justice process. The theological foundations of medieval punishment were also significant. Many punishment methods were designed to provide opportunities for repentance and spiritual renewal, with religious officials playing important roles in punishment administration. What made medieval punishment philosophy particularly boring was its emphasis on gradual behavior modification rather than dramatic intervention. Most punishments were designed to slowly encourage conformity through sustained social pressure, rather than sudden transformation through severe consequences. The intellectual framework underlying medieval punishment was also remarkably sophisticated, with detailed theoretical discussions about the relationship between justice, community, and individual behavior. These discussions were conducted primarily by religious and legal scholars, who developed elaborate theological and philosophical justifications for various punishment methods. Medieval punishment systems had significant economic dimensions that influenced their development and implementation. The costs of punishment administration were substantial, requiring communities to allocate significant resources to justice systems. The construction and maintenance of punishment devices required skilled craftsmen, expensive materials, and ongoing maintenance expense. Communities had to balance the costs of punishment administration against other public needs, leading to detailed economic planning for justice systems. Medieval punishment economics also included the indirect costs of removing offenders from productive work. Communities had to consider the economic impact of punishment on both the offender and their families, as well as the broader community effects of disrupting normal economic activities. The economic benefits of punishment systems were also significant. Punishment spectacles attracted visitors and created economic opportunities for local businesses. Communities often viewed punishment administration as a form of economic development that could attract resources and attention. What made punishment economics particularly boring was the detailed accounting required to manage justice systems. Medieval communities maintained extensive financial records related to punishment administration, tracking every expense and revenue source associated with justice activity. The long-term economic planning required for punishment systems was also remarkably sophisticated. Communities had to project future punishment needs, plan for equipment replacement cycles, and coordinate justice expenses with other public spending priorities. Medieval punishment technology was surprisingly sophisticated, incorporating advanced engineering principles and innovative design solutions. The development of punishment devices required significant technical expertise and represented substantial investments in justice infrastructure. The engineering challenges involved in punishment device construction were considerable. Devices had to be durable enough to withstand weather and use, secure enough to prevent escape, and adjustable enough to accommodate different body sizes and offense type. Medieval craftsmen developed specialized techniques for punishment device construction, including advanced metalworking methods, sophisticated woodworking joints, and innovative rope and chain systems. These technical innovations represented significant advances in applied engineering. The maintenance of punishment technology also required ongoing technical expertise. Communities employed skilled craftsmen specifically to maintain justice equipment, creating specialized professions focused entirely on punishment device operation. What made punishment technology particularly boring was its focus on reliability and standardization rather than innovation. Medieval communities prioritized consistent performance over technological advancement, leading to punishment systems that remained largely unchanged for centuries. The documentation of punishment technology provides insight into the surprisingly advanced technical capabilities of medieval craftsmen. Punishment devices incorporated sophisticated mechanical principles and represented some of the most complex engineering projects undertaken by medieval communities. Medieval punishment psychology was rooted in a somewhat rudimentary yet sophisticated understanding of human behavior, especially given the lack of modern psychological science during that time. The overarching goal was to influence an individual's behavior through the psychological consequences of punishment, rather than just through physical pain. Punishments were often viewed not as retributive acts, but as tools for behavior correction that impacted not only the body but also the mind and soul. One of the key psychological principles that underpinned medieval punishment was the use of public humiliation as a behavior modification technique. Authorities recognized that inflicting physical pain could deter wrongdoing temporarily, but it was public shame and social disapproval that could create lasting psychological scars. Public punishment, such as public flogging, branding, or the stocks, a form of public humiliation where offenders were displayed for the community, was designed to make offenders feel an enduring sense of disgrace. This humiliation not only punished the individual but also served as a warning to others about the consequences of deviating from societal norms. Medieval authorities believed that the fear of social stigma and the trauma associated with public embarrassment could have a long-lasting impact on an individual's psyche, often more so than physical pain. The idea was that the individual would internalize the humiliation, learn from it, and over time change their behavior to avoid future punishment. It was a strategy based not only on deterrence, but also on moral reform. A critical aspect of medieval punishment psychology was the application of graduated punishments, where different levels of severity were meted out depending on the crime committed. Theologians, legal scholars, and religious authorities recognized that a one-size-fits-all approach to punishment was ineffective. They understood that different types of offenses required different psychological intervention. For example, minor infractions might lead to fines, public scorn, or light corporal punishment, while more serious crimes like theft or blasphemy could result in harsh penalties such as mutilation or execution. This graduated approach reflected a psychological understanding that individuals respond differently to various levels of punishment, and that harsher consequences were only necessary for more egregious offenses. By varying the severity of the punishment, authorities believed they could better influence the offender's future behavior and discourage repeated transgressions. The psychology of punishment also recognized the need for reform, though this was often more about compliance than rehabilitation. While medieval punishment systems were more focused on deterrence and social control than on rehabilitation, there were elements within the system designed to encourage moral reflection. Offenders were often required to confess their sins, repent, and sometimes even participate in acts of penance, which were meant to repair their souls and their standing within the community. In some cases, such as with religious offenders, punishment involved a spiritual component where the individual was encouraged to seek redemption, reflecting the medieval belief in the importance of spiritual purity alongside social order. Another significant factor was the role of the community in the psychological aspects of punishment. Punishments were often designed to be community affairs, with members of the public either involved in the punishment or compelled to witness. This collective participation in justice was believed to strengthen the bond between the individual and the larger society, ensuring that the offender did not just repent for their own sake, but also for the well-being of the community as a whole. The psychological impact of being shunned or condemned by one's own neighbors was often seen as one of the most effective ways of instilling a sense of guilt and encouraging behavioral change. What was particularly limiting about medieval punishment psychology was the lack of consideration for individual psychological differences. The system was built on the premise that all individuals would react similarly to the same type of punishment. There was little recognition of the complexities of human psychology, such as mental health conditions, personality disorders, or the possibility that some individuals might not respond to punishment in the expected way. Medieval punishment systems were designed around the assumption that all offenders were motivated by the same desires, e.g., greed, lust, anger, and would be deterred by similar intervention. This lack of individualization meant that some individuals may have been unfairly or ineffectively punished. Those with mental health conditions, for instance, might not have experienced the deterrent effects intended by their punishments, and in some cases, punishment might have exacerbated their psychological distress. Despite this, the medieval justice system did not make accommodations for psychological variances in the same way modern systems do. The theoretical framework behind medieval punishment psychology was not only influenced by practical needs, but was deeply informed by religious and philosophical ideas about sin, morality, and divine justice. Scholarly discussions on punishment were often framed within the context of Christian theology, which posited that punishment was necessary to cleanse the soul and restore the individual to a state of moral purity. Religious scholars and legal experts debated the most effective means of instilling fear of God and moral repentance in individuals. These discussions were not just theoretical, they had real-world implications, as they informed how laws were written and how justice was administered. Legal scholars and theologians elaborated on the importance of moral deterrence, and how the fear of divine wrath, in addition to the fear of human punishment, could change behavior. While these ideas were largely grounded in religious thought, they also laid the groundwork for the secularization of punishment and behavior modification that would come in later centuries. In conclusion, the psychology behind medieval punishment was deeply intertwined with the societal and religious frameworks of the time. While punishment strategies were designed to shape and control behavior through psychological mechanisms like shame, fear, and guilt, the lack of individual consideration and reliance on generalized approaches ultimately made medieval punishment systems less effective than they could have been in promoting true reform or understanding the complexities of human behavior.
Medieval punishment sociology focused primarily on the relationship between individual behavior and social order, with a strong emphasis on how justice systems not only deterred criminal behavior, but also reinforced the broader social values and hierarchies that were fundamental to the medieval worldview. These punishment systems were intricately woven into the fabric of medieval society, with deep links to religion, morality, and the maintenance of community cohesion. The punitive mechanisms employed were not simply about punishing the wrongdoer, but also about sending a message to the wider community, signaling acceptable behavior and preserving the moral and social order. At the heart of medieval punishment sociology was the idea of social control, where punishment served as a tool to enforce and reinforce the norms that structured everyday life. Medieval society was deeply hierarchical, with rigid social distinctions based on factors such as class, religion, and gender. Punishment, in this context, was not just a response to deviant behavior, it was a means of maintaining these power structures. The judicial system was inherently conservative, designed to preserve the status quo and the existing social order rather than to address the causes of criminal behavior or attempt rehabilitation. Medieval punishment was seen as a social function, with the community playing a crucial role in its enforcement. Punishment was often public, and its goals extended beyond the mere correction of individual offenders. The public nature of punishment, whether it was a flogging, execution, or imprisonment, served as a demonstration of the community's values and as a reminder of the consequences of deviating from these norms. In a world where religion and tradition were deeply entwined, punishment also served to underline the divine order, reinforcing the idea that those who transgressed against society were also sinning against God. Punishment in medieval society was largely symbolic. Its role was not just about retribution, but also about ritual. The public nature of many punishments, including trials, executions, and corporal punishment, turned these events into civic rituals where social control was exercised through collective involvement, whether through observing, participating in, or assisting with the punishment. The community was involved in the socialization process, understanding that compliance with societal norms was a communal responsibility. Medieval punishment systems were also designed to integrate offenders back into society, emphasizing the idea that justice should seek to correct behavior and allow for reintegration, rather than merely excluding the offender permanently. The goal was not to isolate the criminal but to allow them to atone for their sins, both socially and spiritually. This reintegration was often mediated through symbolic gestures, such as the requirement to wear signs of one's shame, perform acts of penance, or participate in public displays of repentance. However, the medieval justice system did not always aim for inclusion. Social integration was not universal, and there were instances when offenders, especially those from lower social classes, were permanently excluded or marginalized. For instance, in cases of heresy or blasphemy, the punishment was often death or lifelong ostracism. Social class and status played a critical role in determining whether an offender would be reintegrated into the community or permanently cast out. The medieval understanding of punishment was inherently linked to the concept of sin, with religious officials often playing the dual role of both judge and moral authority, determining the extent to which an offender could atone for their wrongdoings. While some offenses could be forgiven through penance, others, particularly those that threatened the social or divine order, like witchcraft, heresy, or treason, were considered beyond redemption and resulted in the harshest punishment. In contrast, lower status individuals, such as peasants and serfs, had fewer opportunities for reintegration. They were often subjected to harsh punishments without the chance for redemption, reflecting the social divide between the ruling elites and the common folk. The idea of social integration therefore existed mostly for those who had the means and status to reintegrate, while for many commoners, punishment was a means of solidifying social distinctions and maintaining control. Public punishment was central to the medieval concept of punishment sociology. The public spectacle of punishment was not just about the individual's guilt or redemption, but about reinforcing the moral order for the entire community. Punishments such as executions, public whipping, or shaming rituals were designed to remind people of the consequences of wrongdoing. These punishments were intended to be seen, felt, and internalized by the entire community, creating a shared understanding of right and wrong. Medieval justice was thus inherently theatrical, a form of public spectacle that was aimed at reinforcing communal norms. The purpose of these displays was to publicly affirm the values of the community, ensuring that citizens understood the societal expectations they were supposed to live by. Public punishments often took place in open squares or marketplaces, where large numbers of people could gather, observe the punishment, and learn from it. The social function of these public punishments was to serve as both a deterrent and a method of social teaching. Punishments were not just about the wrongdoer's suffering, but about sending a clear and unequivocal message to the community. The hope was that by seeing the consequences of misdeeds, others would be less likely to commit similar crimes. One of the most significant punishments, the execution, was often seen as a public ritual that underscored the ultimate authority of the monarch or the church. Executions were often elaborate affairs, with the condemned person paraded before the crowd, made to confess their sins, and then executed in a manner that demonstrated the power and authority of the state or religious institution. This spectacle served not only as punishment, but also as an affirmation of the moral and legal order, a reminder that the community was bound by laws that were divinely sanctioned. The concept of justice in medieval punishment sociology was deeply influenced by social class. Punishment systems reflected and reinforced the social hierarchies that characterized medieval society. The elites, nobles, and clergy were often exempt from the most severe punishments, especially in cases where their offenses were seen as less damaging to the social order. They had the means to avoid the public punishments that were inflicted upon commoners, often through the payment of fines, or by seeking clemency from religious or secular authority. The concept of justice in medieval society was not designed to be blind. It was designed to maintain the existing social order. The nobility and clergy were often treated with leniency in comparison to the common. A noble might be granted a trial by peers or even allowed to avoid punishment altogether, while a peasant might face public humiliation or corporal punishment for offences of the same magnitude. This was a reflection of the belief that certain individuals were inherently more valuable to society and that their status should be preserved. Moreover, punishment for women was also heavily influenced by gender norms. Women, particularly those of lower social status, were often subjected to different types of punishment than men, based on ideas about gender roles and the perceived moral weakness of women. Women accused of crimes such as adultery, witchcraft, or blasphemy were often punished more severely than men, with executions and public humiliation used as tools to reinforce patriarchal control. The punishments for nobility often served to reinforce their social standing, whereas punishments for commoners and women reinforced their subjugated position. These punishments were often meant not only to discipline but to remind those who were lower in the social hierarchy of their subordinate position in the social structure. Punishments were designed to maintain the status quo, with the church and the monarchy playing central roles in ensuring that the rules of society were adhered to. The overall structure of medieval punishment was inherently conservative, focused more on maintaining traditional values and social roles than on addressing the root causes of criminal behavior. This conservative nature of punishment sociology meant that deviance was often seen as a direct challenge to the social order. The more extreme forms of punishment, such as execution or branding, were intended not just to punish the individual but to send a powerful message to the community about the consequences of deviating from societal norms. In this way, punishment was as much about reinforcing existing power structures as it was about deterring crime. The use of punishment to maintain social order was also closely linked to religious doctrine. Religious leaders and institutions were not only responsible for the spiritual well-being of the community, but also played a significant role in the administration of justice. In many medieval societies, the church had significant influence over legal proceedings, and ecclesiastical courts often handled cases of heresy, blasphemy, and other offences against religious norms. In this context, punishment served not only as a tool for social control but also as a way of enforcing religious orthodoxy. While medieval punishment sociology was theoretically rich and multifaceted, it often lacked the depth and flexibility needed to address the complexity of human behavior. The emphasis on social conformity, rather than individual justice, meant that the medieval justice system was more focused on maintaining social cohesion than on understanding the nuanced motivations behind deviant behavior. The limitations of medieval punishment sociology became clear when it was applied to individuals who did not conform to the social norms in ways that were easily understood or categorized. The system was rigid, and its focus on conformity left little room for rehabilitation or individualized justice. The punishment system's focus on public spectacle and social control often meant that the underlying causes of criminal behavior were ignored in favor of maintaining traditional power structures. It was deeply embedded in the bureaucratic and institutional systems of the time, which were often complex and highly structured. While medieval punishment might seem at first glance to be chaotic and brutal, it was in fact governed by elaborate systems designed to ensure its effectiveness and fairness, albeit through the lens of the time's understanding of justice and morality. These systems involved many layers of officials, complex procedures, extensive documentation, and an intricate network of coordination between religious, civil, and local authorities. At its core, the goal of medieval punishment administration was to maintain order, enforce social norms, and demonstrate the authority of the governing body, whether secular or ecclesiastical. At the heart of the medieval punishment system was a sprawling bureaucracy that involved multiple levels of officials, each with specific roles in the enforcement of justice. These officials ranged from local town leaders to high-ranking religious and legal authorities, all of whom contributed to the implementation and oversight of punishment systems. The medieval justice system did not have the efficiency or standardized procedures that modern systems have, but it was highly structured in its own way, reflecting the hierarchical nature of medieval society. The administration of punishment could be broken down into several distinct roles and offices, each with specific responsibilities. Local town officials. At the lowest level of administration were town officials, including mayors, sheriffs and bailiffs, who were tasked with overseeing the daily enforcement of laws. These officials were often responsible for carrying out minor punishments, such as public floggings, or overseeing the imprisonment of offenders awaiting trial. They were also involved in maintaining order during public executions or other spectacles of punishment. Guild representatives. In some medieval towns, particularly those with strong mercantile or artisan communities, guilds played a key role in the administration of justice. Guild leaders could act as judges in disputes between members, enforcing punishments for offences within their own ranks. These guilds operated in a somewhat autonomous manner, with their own rules and procedures for dealing with members who violated their codes of conduct. For instance, a craftsman who produced shoddy work might face punishment through a guild trial, resulting in fines, expulsion or public shame. Religious authorities. Religious figures, priests, bishops and other church officials, often had significant influence over medieval punishment systems, particularly in cases involving moral or spiritual offences. Ecclesiastical courts were a major component of the medieval justice system, dealing with crimes such as heresy, blasphemy, and adultery. These courts were separate from secular courts and were guided by religious principles rather than civil law. In many cases, punishments administered by religious authorities included excommunication, penance or penitent public displays of shame, like wearing a scapular or hesh. Judges and magistrates. More serious crimes, especially those that could lead to executions, were typically handled by magistrates or judges, often appointed by kings, bishops or other powerful leaders. These individuals had legal training and were tasked with deciding the severity of punishment based on the crime committed. They worked within the framework of local laws, but often had a degree of discretion to apply punishment according to their own judgment. Specialized punishment administrators. In larger medieval societies, there were also specialized officials, such as executioners, torturers and wardens of prisons, who were responsible for carrying out the actual physical punishment. Executioners, for example, had the specialized task of overseeing executions, which ranged from beheadings to hanging, burning, or even more gruesome methods like boiling in oil or being drawn and quartered. These officials often held a lower social status, and their role was highly stigmatized due to the nature of their work. The executioner's role was both a practical and symbolic one, as they were the ultimate enforcers of the laws and the social order. The administration of medieval punishment involved not just the physical aspects of enforcement, but also significant bureaucratic coordination. The complexity of managing punishment in a society with limited communication and transportation meant that these systems had to rely on extensive documentation, detailed records, and regular communication between officials at various levels. Documentation of offenses. One of the primary tasks of punishment administration was the accurate documentation of crimes and punishments. This included written records of the offenses committed, the names of the accused and the accuser, the punishment handed down, and any other relevant detail. In some cases, the records were maintained in local town halls, while more important cases might be documented in regional or royal archives. Religious authorities also kept detailed records, particularly for cases involving moral or spiritual offenses. These records were essential not only for ensuring that punishments were carried out correctly, but also for creating a history of justice in the region, which could be referenced in future trials. Punishment records and device maintenance. Another important aspect of the bureaucratic administration of punishment was the maintenance of punishment devices, such as the stocks, pillories, and gallows. Town officials were responsible for ensuring that these devices were in good working order, and records were often kept about their construction, maintenance, and use. The same was true for any instruments used in torture, such as the breaking wheel or the rack, where detailed records would be kept of the equipment's use and condition. These records ensured that punishment tools were not only functional but also available when needed. Financial accounting. The financial aspect of punishment administration was also crucial. Many medieval punishments required financial resources, whether it was to pay the executioner, provide for the maintenance of prisons, or ensure that public punishments could be carried out with the necessary material. Town treasurers or other financial officers were responsible for keeping track of these costs and ensuring that the funds for punishment administration were properly allocated. This could include everything from paying for the construction of execution platforms to compensating informants or witnesses in trials. Coordination between authorities. The logistical and bureaucratic complexity of medieval punishment meant that there needed to be coordination between different levels of authority. For example, if a punishment required the involvement of both secular and ecclesiastical officials, as might be the case with a heretic, the officials would need to communicate and work together to determine the punishment and ensure its proper execution. This coordination could extend to the transportation of prisoners, particularly for those who were sentenced to execution or imprisonment far from their original location. Public punishments, especially those that involved a spectacle, such as executions or public floggings, were scheduled events that required significant preparation. The scheduling was not always as simple as determining the time and place. It also involved coordinating with other events in the community to ensure that the punishment would not interfere with religious holidays, markets or festivals. This was particularly important in larger towns or cities, where public punishments were often the central event of the day, drawing large crowds and attention. Time and location of public punishments. Town officials were responsible for determining when and where public punishments would occur. This could involve choosing a central location such as the town square or market, where the maximum number of people could witness the punishment. The timing of the punishment was also important, as it had to be synchronized with local events. For example, an execution might be scheduled during a religious festival to emphasize the divine nature of the justice being administered, or it could be timed with market days, when the community was already gathered. Logistics of prisoners and punishment tools. The logistics of transporting prisoners to the place of punishment was another challenge for medieval authorities. In larger towns, prisoners might be held in local dungeons or towers, which required wardens to oversee their care and security. For more serious offences, prisoners might be transported to regional or royal prisons, which often had their own complex systems for managing detainees. The transport of prisoners could involve guards, specialized carts, and additional documentation to ensure that prisoners were not tampered with or released by unauthorized individuals. The tools needed for punishment were another logistical. For example, the stocks, gallows, or other instruments of punishment needed to be kept in good condition and ready for use. In cases of torture, specialized equipment like the rack, thumbscrews, or iron maidens needed to be maintained, and their use was carefully logged by authorities to ensure that they were used appropriately. One of the most striking features of medieval punishment administration was the emphasis on procedural compliance. While the outcomes of punishment were of critical importance, there was an equally strong focus on ensuring that the correct procedures were followed in the administration of justice. This focus on procedure was often tied to the belief that proper legal and religious processes were necessary to maintain the legitimacy of the punishment system. Emphasis on proper procedure. Officials were trained to follow strict protocols when it came to carrying out punishment. This included documenting every aspect of the punishment, from the trial to the sentencing, the carrying out of the punishment itself, and any follow-up actions, such as the return of a prisoner to their cell or the disposal of a body after execution. The need for procedural compliance often made the system slow and inefficient, as bureaucratic processes took precedence over the speed of justice. Inefficiency and red tape. The medieval justice system, despite its complexity, was often mired in inefficiency. The emphasis on documentation, procedural compliance, and communication between various officials meant that the punishment system was slow and cumbersome. This inefficiency sometimes led to delays in the execution of punishments, with offenders languishing in jails or awaiting trial for months, if not years. The burden of paperwork and the constant coordination between officials slowed down the system, making it frustratingly inefficient for those involved. These officials were often looked down upon by society, despite the fact that they played an essential role in maintaining social order. Executioners, for example, were typically regarded as outcasts, with their profession seen as dirty, immoral, and even sinful. This stigma extended to their families, who often faced social ostracism due to the nature of their work. Training of punishment officials. The training required for punishment officials was extensive and often highly specialized. Executioners needed to be skilled in various forms of execution, from beheading to hanging, and they had to be familiar with the tools and techniques involved in their craft. Torturers, similarly, needed to be proficient in the use of torture devices and in knowing when and how to apply pressure to extract confessions. Wardens and jailers, meanwhile, had to be trained in the logistics of prison management, ensuring that prisoners were securely housed and transported. Stigma and social exclusion. Despite the crucial role they played in maintaining social order, punishment officials were often ostracized by society. The stigma associated with their work meant that they were often relegated to lower social strata, and their families faced similar social exclusion. The stigma attached to their profession sometimes made it difficult for punishment administrators to integrate into normal social life, creating a sense of isolation that compounded the already difficult nature of their work. As we conclude our journey through the remarkably tedious world of medieval punishment, it's worth reflecting on how these bizarre methods reveal the complex relationship between justice, community, and social order in medieval society. What made medieval punishments particularly strange was not their cruelty, but their elaborate bureaucratic nature. Most of these devices were rarely used for their intended purpose, instead serving as complex social theatre designed to reinforce community values and maintain social control. The extensive documentation surrounding medieval punishment reveals communities that were remarkably concerned with procedural compliance, administrative efficiency, and social conformity. The actual punishment devices were often less important than the elaborate systems developed to operate and maintain them. Medieval punishment methods were ultimately boring because they were designed to be boring. The goal was not excitement or drama, but the steady, predictable reinforcement of social norms through tedious, routine public humiliation. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you can rest assured that the medieval world of punishment was far more concerned with paperwork than with actual torture. The most effective medieval punishments were those that were so mundane and routine that they became part of the normal fabric of community life. Sweet dreams, and remember, even medieval torture was mostly just bureaucracy.